Hello, everyone. Welcome to Speak. Today, we're doing a deep dive into this really significant piece of proposed legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA.
Right, sometimes called Trump's check. We've basically gone through a whole stack of news reports, analyses.
Trying to distill it down.
Exactly. Our goal here is to unpack the main parts of this bill, what's in it, and then explore what the ripple effects might be.
For the U.S. economy, but also, importantly, for allies, too.
Yeah, globally.
Okay, so let's jump in. This thing, H.R. 1, it's huge. A budget reconciliation bill pulling recommendations from, 11 House committees?
11 committees, yeah. And they're aiming to get this done fast using that reconciliation process.
Which means they could potentially bypass a Senate filibuster, right? Get it through quicker.
That's the idea. Aiming for a July 4th approval, which is ambitious.
Very. Okay, so where do we start? Taxes seem like the obvious place, always a big part of these packages.
Definitely. And a core part of this is essentially continuing the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act policies.
So making those individual income tax cuts permanent, or at least extending them, and the estate tax exemption, too.
Exactly. Keeping that basic structure in place. But there's new stuff, too.
Like what new relief measures are we seeing?
Well, there's a temporary break, 2026 to 2028, on taxes for tips and overtime pay for certain workers.
Okay.
And a partial interest exemption for loans, but specifically on American-made cars.
Ah, the Made in America angle.
Right. And maybe more broadly relevant, a proposed increase in the standard deduction could be up to $32,000 for joint filers.
That's pretty significant. What about the child tax credit, the CTC, always a focus for families?
They're proposing a temporary boost up to $2,500. Then it would drop back to $2,000 but be indexed to inflation.
But there's a catch there, isn't there? Something about Social Security numbers.
Yes, that's a major point of concern. The estimates suggest over 4.5 million kids, mostly U.S. citizens, could lose the CTC because their parents don't have SSNs.
Wow. That's a lot of children potentially impacted.
It is. And for seniors, there's a proposal for an extra deduction, maybe around $4,000, aimed at reducing taxes on their Social Security benefits.
Okay. Now, the SALT deduction, state and local tax, that's always contentious, especially between Republicans.
Absolutely. It was apparently a big internal debate. The proposal now is to raise the cap to $40,000 for married couples.
But only up to a certain income level.
Right, up to $500,000 in income with a phase-out above that. So it helps some, but it's targeted.
Got it. What about businesses? Any changes there?
Yeah, for pass-through businesses, think smaller businesses, partnerships, S-Corp, the QBI deduction, that qualified business income deduction might go up from 20% to 23%.
A bit more relief there.
And temporarily, they want to allow full expensing, 100% bonus depreciation for domestic R&D costs, machinery, equipment, even factory investments.
Trying to spur investment, presumably.
That seems to be the goal. Plus, extending the lower tax rate for multinational corporations on their overseas income. Okay, so lots of tax cuts and extensions, which inevitably leads to the question, how are they proposing to pay for all this or offset the cost?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, right? A key measure is rolling back clean energy tax credits.
The ones from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Exactly. Repealing them or speeding up their phase-out. So credits for EVs, solar, wind, battery storage. That's a direct reversal of Biden administration policy.
A huge shift in energy policy baked into the tax code. What else?
There's a proposed 21% tax on the endowment funds of some really large universities.
Targeting university endowments.
Yeah. And new annual fees for people who own electric or hybrid vehicles.
So hitting EVs from both sides, removing credits and adding fees.
Seems that way. And finally, this idea of a MAGA account.
Right, I saw that. Tax-free savings for newborns with government contribution.
Yeah, the details are a bit sparse in the sources, but that's the concept presented.
Okay. Quite a lot happening on the tax front. Let's pivot to another major focus, border security and immigration. Absolutely. The bill allocates significant new funding for, physical barriers.
Yeah.
More border wall sections, aquatic barriers too.
And it's not just physical walls, right? There's a tech component.
Yes, funding for upgrading existing barriers with technology, the smart wall concept. More sensors, surveillance.
And detention capacity. I heard something about a big increase there.
A massive increase. They're proposing to raise the number of ICE detention beds from the current level of around 34,000 up to a target of 100,000.
Wow. That's almost tripling the capacity.
It's a huge expansion. And alongside that, a big personnel surge.
More agents and officers.
Yeah, plans to hire 3,000 more Border Patrol agents, 5,000 additional customs officers, and 10,000 new ICE officers.
10,000. That signals a really significant enforcement ramp-up.
Definitely. And the sources also mentioned funding specifically aimed at supporting the deportation of 1 million immigrants per year.
1 million a year, and tying that to the 100,000 detention beds.
It paints a picture of a very aggressive enforcement and removal strategy.
Are there changes to fees, too, for people going through the legal immigration process?
Yes. A new $1,000 fee proposed just for asylum seekers.
$1,000 to apply for asylum.
That's the proposal. Plus increases in other fees, like the visa integrity fee and the I-94 form fee.
And some analyses, like from Brookings, suggest these kinds of restrictive policies could actually slow down economic growth, right?
They do. They argue it could negatively impact GDP growth. But the bill's focus seems squarely on the enforcement and security aspects, framing immigration primarily through that lens.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Defense spending, another area getting a big boost.
A very big boost. Around $150 billion in new funding proposed for the Department of Defense and national security overall. The House Armed Services Committee number was slightly lower, maybe $144 billion, but still huge.
Where's that money going specifically? Any big-ticket items?
Oh, yeah. $25 billion for something called the Golden Dome for America missile defense system.
Golden Dome, okay.
$34 billion for shipbuilding and expanding the Navy's fleet. Though it's worth noting, about $32 billion of that is projected to add directly to the deficit.
Right, so not offset.
Not that part, no. Same for ammunition stockpiles, $21 billion allocated, with over $19 billion of that adding to the deficit.
So borrowing for bullets and ships, basically. What else?
Lots more. About $30 billion for air superiority and general missile defense, $12.6 billion for nuclear deterrence modernization, almost $11 billion for military readiness.
And focus on specific regions.
Yes, $10.5 billion specifically for deterrence and readiness in the Pacific Theater. And then there's funding for personnel salary, housing, childcare, quality of life improvements, somewhere between $8 and $9 billion.
Even border security gets some DoD funding.
About $5 billion is earmarked for the DoD's role in border security, plus over $2 billion for military intelligence, cyber, and surveillance.
So it's a broad-based increase. What's the bigger strategic picture here?
It fits into the stated goal of pushing the total defense budget towards $1 trillion by fiscal year 2026.
$1 trillion.
Yeah. Proponents argue it's necessary to reverse what they see as underfunding under the current stopgap measures, which they say hinders modernization.
And the focus is on specific areas.
Right. Nuclear modernization, missile defense, definitely drones and autonomous weapon systems, and cybersecurity. Those seem to be the priorities.
Okay, defense expansion covered. Now let's talk about reshaping social programs. Medicaid, SNAP. This looks like another area of major change.
It really is. A key element is introducing or expanding work requirements for people receiving Medicaid or SNAP benefits.
We're talking able-bodied adults without dependents.
Primarily, yes. The requirement might be something like 80 hours of work per month, and they're also looking at raising the age limit for SNAP work requirements, possibly up to age 64.
So potentially affecting more people for longer. What about the funding levels for these programs?
Proposed cuts. Significant cuts to the federal funding share for both Medicaid and SNAP.
Which likely means states have to pick up the slack or services get reduced.
Or both. The projected cuts to SNAP alone are huge. Maybe $270 to $290 billion over 10 years. The CBO's overall estimate for cuts to Medicaid, food stamps, and related services is around $1 trillion over the decade.
$1 trillion? What's the human impact expected to be?
The CBO projections are stark. They estimate 8.6 million people could lose health insurance due to the Medicaid and ACA changes.
8.6 million.
And for SNAP, they project about 3 million people per month could lose benefits. The overall assessment is that the lowest income families will see their resources decrease.
What's the justification given for these kinds of cuts?
The argument usually centers on eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, promoting self-sufficiency and the need for savings.
But the counter-argument is pretty strong too, right?
Absolutely. Critics, mainly Democrats, argue these cuts harm the most vulnerable populations simply to fund tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the wealthy.
Are there other changes? Anything targeting specific groups?
Yes. There are penalties proposed for states that provide Medicaid to undocumented immigrants, and a measure to limit future administrative increases in S&M benefits, essentially capping them at the inflation rate.
Okay. Let's turn to something with potentially big international waves. The proposed remittance tax.
Yeah, this was getting a lot of attention. It's a proposed 5% excise tax on money sent abroad remittances, but only by non-U.S. citizens.
So green card holders, temporary workers like H-1B, they pay this tax.
That's the proposal. U.S. citizens would be exempt.
Who does that affect? How many people are we talking about?
Estimates are it could impact over 40 million people currently living and working in the U.S.
40 million. And the idea is this raises revenue.
That's the rationale. They project it could bring in about $22 billion over 10 years, which they say would help offset the deficit increase from other parts of the bill.
But it's controversial. What are the main concerns being raised?
Several big ones. First is a double taxation. This money is usually earned after U.S. income taxes have already been paid. Second, there's a real risk. It pushes people towards informal, unregulated ways of sending money home. Maybe using cash networks or even crypto. Harder to track, potentially riskier.
And countries receiving these funds aren't happy.
Not at all. Strong opposition reported from Mexico and India, for example, who are major recipients of remittances from the U.S.
It definitely seems like a friction point. Okay, let's talk about the debt ceiling. That's wrapped up in this bill, too.
Yes, it includes a provision to raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion.
Which is necessary because the U.S. is projected to hit the current limit soon?
Exactly. The Treasury Secretary warned the government could run out of borrowing authority, basically run out of cash to pay its bills, as early as August without action.
And just to clarify, raising the debt ceiling doesn't authorize new spending, right? It just lets the government pay for what Congress has already approved.
Precisely. It's about paying existing obligations. But tying it to this larger bill creates a complex fiscal strategy debate.
How so? What's the debate?
Well, the White House is claiming the entire OBBBA package will actually reduce the deficit over time through a combination of economic growth spurred by the tax cuts and the spending cuts.
But independent analyses disagree.
Strongly disagree for the most part. The CBO, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB, the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, they all project the bill will significantly increase the deficit. That's a central point of contention.
Okay, let's dig into those differing assessments. What are the numbers looking like for the U.S. domestic economic impact?
It's a really wide range. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, says the tax parts alone will add about $3.8 trillion to the deficit over 10 years.
Wow.
They do say the spending cuts on Medicaid, SNAP, etc. will save about $1 trillion. But the net result, still a big deficit increase in their view.
What about the CRFB? They're usually focused on debt.
They estimate a $2.5 trillion increase in the primary deficit. That's before interest payments.
Yeah.
Factor in interest. And they see the national debt rising by $3.1 trillion.
And potentially even more.
Yet, if the temporary provisions are made permanent down the line, they warn the debt increase could hit $5.1 trillion. That could push the debt to GDP ratio to a record 125%.
That's sobering. And the AEI.
They also see a deficit increase as highly likely at least $1.5 trillion over 10 years, with risks it could be substantially worse.
So how does the White House get to won't add to the deficit?
They rely on very optimistic economic growth forecasts, claiming the bill will stimulate enough growth to generate an extra $2.6 trillion in tax revenue, plus the $1.6 trillion in spending cuts they identify.
But independent analysts are skeptical of those growth numbers.
Highly skeptical. Many economists think the tax cuts alone could add anywhere from $3 to $5 trillion to the deficit. And that YouGov poll showed 37% of Americans expect the deficit to go up.
So a fundamental disagreement on the fiscal math. What about market reactions? Any ripples felt already?
We've seen U.S. Treasury yields tick up. The 10-year went over 4.5%, the 30-year over 5%. That often signals investor concern about future government debt levels.
The stocks reacted too.
The stock market opened lower when the bill details emerged, as investors tried to parse the implications. And remember, past tariff announcements under Trump caused huge market swings, so there's sensitivity there.
And credit rating agencies are watching.
Definitely. Moody's downgrade of the U.S. credit rating mentioned the existing $36 trillion debt and specifically cited concerns that OBBBA could make things worse, raising questions about long-term fiscal sustainability.
So increased nervousness about U.S. debt overall.
It seems so. And interestingly, some analysts note rising interest in assets like Bitcoin, possibly as a hedge against these kinds of fiscal concerns and potential inflation.
Okay, let's zoom in on specific industries. Who wins, who loses under this bill?
Clean energy looks like a clear loser. Repealing or phasing out those tax credits for wind, solar, batteries, EVs, that's a major headwind.
Directly reversing current policy.
Exactly. On the flip side, the fossil fuel industry likely benefits. expedited project approvals, new oil and gas leases.
Yeah.
That helps them.
What about autos? It seems mixed.
Very mixed. Losing the EV tax credits hurts electric adoption. But the temporary interest exemption on loans for U.S.-made cars could boost traditional car sales. Then again, new annual fees on EVs and hybrids work against them.
So complicated. Manufacturing.
Potential benefits there. That 100% depreciation for factories and equipment, plus restoring the R&D tax credit that could incentivize domestic manufacturing investment.
Agriculture.
Also mixed. Boosts for commodity support programs in the Farm Bill, some favorable tax changes.
Yeah.
But the big SNAP cuts could really hit food demand, hurting grocers and the local economies that depend on them.
The downstream effects. Crypto.
Might actually see a bump. That 5% remittance tax could push more people towards using crypto for international transfers to avoid the fee.
An unintended consequence, perhaps. Defense industry.
A clear winner. All that increased spending on ships, ammo, missile defense, they stand to benefit significantly.
And health.
Hospitals, especially those serving many Medicaid patients, could face serious financial strain from the funding cuts. That could lead to higher prices for private insurance holders, or even closures. And defunding Planned Parenthood impacts access to certain services.
Okay, so a complex web of impacts across the economy. What does this mean for everyday American households? Social welfare.
The impact really seems to diverge based on income. CBO analysis suggests the wealthiest households gain the most from the tax changes, while the lowest income families lose resources due to the spending cuts.
Fueling the debate about fairness.
Precisely. Extending the 2017 cuts helps many, but the benefit is larger for higher earners. The new targeted breaks tips, overtime, the elderly deduction, the CTC boost aim at working middle class and seniors. But the SALT cap increase mostly helps higher earners in high-tax states who itemize.
And the social program changes have direct consequences for the safety net.
Huge consequences. The CBO numbers again. 8.6 million potentially losing health insurance, 3 million per month losing SNAP. The work requirements could also push people off benefits if they can't meet the hours or handle the paperwork. Caregivers, students, people with fluctuating health.
And public opinion seems to run counter to these cuts.
Yeah, that YouGov poll showed strong support for increasing funding for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP. The opposite direction of the bill. And remember that CTC issue for immigrant families? 4.5 million kids, mostly citizens, losing out because their parents lack SSNs.
Okay, let's broaden the view again. How might this impact key U.S. allies? What's the international fallout?
Well, you have to see it in the context of a potential Trump 2.0 trade policy, which many expect to be even more aggressive with tariffs.
Sharper and broader tariffs.
That's the expectation. Using tariffs as a tool against perceived unfair trade, with an America-first approach that might put less emphasis on traditional alliances. We've already seen market jitters from announced tariffs, potentially 10% up to over 50% on various goods.
And the remittance tax hits specific allies very directly. Mexico.
Mexico is a huge one. They received maybe $64 billion in remittances from the U.S. in 2024. A 5% tax is over $3 billion in potential U.S. revenue. Mexico's leadership is strongly opposed.
Calling it unfair.
Unfair and regressive, yeah. And warning it could push money into informal channels, affecting millions of Mexicans in the U.S.
India, another major recipient.
The largest globally. About $32 billion sent home by Indians in the U.S. last year. Analysts there estimate a 10–15% drop could mean a $12–18 billion loss in foreign exchange annually.
Potentially weakening the rupee.
Potentially, yeah. It hits H-1B workers, green card holders, reduces funds for families back home for healthcare, education, especially in smaller cities.
The Philippines, Central America.
Philippines is also expected to be significantly hit. Central American countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala rely heavily on remittances. It's like a fifth of El Salvador's GDP. Estimates suggest a potential 10% drop in flows there, too.
So it ripples out significantly. What about the EU? How are they bracing for this?
They face the threat of indiscriminate tariffs. EU leaders call it a major blow to the world economy, likely worsening inflation, disrupting supply chains.
So they're thinking about how to respond.
Yeah, how to potentially reshape the global order if the U.S. steps back from leadership, how to resist coercion, reduce dependence on the U.S., maybe targeted counter-tariffs like hitting U.S. cars if the U.S. hits theirs.
Can their economies handle it?
Major economies like Germany have some fiscal space, but U.S. exports are still about 3% of the EU's GDP. There's also a sense that the administration might see Europe somewhat adversarially.
And the UK, post-Brexit, they're in a different spot.
Potentially more exposed, facing a potential 10% baseline tariff soon, plus existing steel, aluminum, auto tariffs.
Have they retaliated?
Not so far. They're negotiating this economic prosperity partnership. There's a small deal on cars and beef, but the White House called it a historic win for the U.S., suggesting the terms weren't great for the U.K. As an open economy, global trade disruption hits them hard.
Okay, finally, Asia-Pacific allies. Japan, South Korea, Australia.
Japan and South Korea face really high tariffs, 24% and 26%. They've called it extremely regrettable, questioning if it violates trade deals and WTO rules. There's even talk of them boosting cooperation with China in response.
Australia, too, even though the trade balance favors the U.S.
Yeah, they got hit with tariffs, too. The Prime Minister said it was not the act of a friend. They haven't retaliated but aren't happy. Public opinion there is wary of a Trump presidency, concerns about AUKUS, too.
So Australia's strategy is?
Protect their interests, invest in other partnerships, use regional trade pacts like CPTPP and RCEP to build influence. The overall picture in Asia is destabilization from U.S. tariff policies, possibly pushing countries closer together, like restarting China, Japan, Korea FTA talks.
Let's bring it back home. What's the political atmosphere around this bill in Congress? Sounds like tension.
Definitely. Democrats are unified against it, calling it the big ugly bill, saying it hurts families, seniors, veterans, cuts health care, balloons the debt, basically a giveaway to the rich.
But divisions within the Republican Party.
Yes, quite a few. That SALT deduction cap was a big one. Lawmakers from high-tax states wanted more relief. Alarming fiscal conservatives worried about debt. They eventually compromised on the $40 K cap under $500K income.
What other divisions? Spending cuts versus tax cuts?
Right. Hardliners like the Freedom Caucus demanded faster, deeper spending cuts, especially on Medicaid work requirements, and killing clean energy credits to offset the tax cuts. Some conservatives even voted President Committee to show they weren't fully on board.
And moderates had concerns, too.
Worries about the impact of deep Medicaid and SNP cuts in their states, and maybe the clean energy credit repeal affecting local projects or industries.
What's Trump's role in all this? He's actively pushing it.
Reportedly, yes. Lobbying hard for unity. The bill's name, many provisions, they clearly echo his campaign themes. Lots of late-night talks and tweaks to try and win over reluctant Republicans, using that budget reconciliation process as the key tactic.
And outside Congress, public sentiment, expert takes.
That YouGov poll showed more opposition than support overall. People think middle class and poor are most likely to see tax hikes. Many expect their own taxes to rise and think the budget will harm their family, and they expect the deficit to increase.
And yet, they support more funding for social programs.
Exactly. Strong support for boosting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNP, funding the opposite of the bill's direction on some of those.
What about think tanks?
We've touched on them. CBO gives the baseline numbers on deficit, insurance loss, SNP cuts. CRFB hammers the debt increase warnings. AEI is skeptical of deficit reduction claims. Brookings highlights negative impacts of immigration restrictions and the remittance tax. Tax Foundation estimates revenue impacts. And advocacy groups are vocal, too.
Like who?
Americans for Tax Fairness calls it a scam, benefiting billionaires. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a big supporter, calls it pro-growth. Good for small business, good for competitiveness.
What about groups like AARP or labor unions?
The sources didn't have specific OBBBA statements from them, but AARP's mission aligns with protecting Social Security Medicare, which contrasts with the general spending cut direction, though the bill does have that extra deduction for seniors. AFL-CIO concerns seemed more focused on broader anti-union actions, but work requirements and overtime pay exemptions are definitely relevant to labor.
Agricultural groups, nonprofits.
Grocers worried about SNAP cuts hitting demand. But the bill boosts commodity programs and has farm tax benefits. Nonprofits are concerned about a provision letting Treasury suspend tax-exempt status for groups deemed to support terrorism, fearing it could be weaponized against dissent.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. What are the key takeaways, the interconnected impacts?
Well, the bill clearly aims to lock in a specific policy agenda. Tax cuts, border security, defense buildup, reshaping social programs. The central conflict is the fiscal impact of the administration's optimistic growth projections versus independent analyses predicting huge debt increases.
And domestic choices have international consequences.
Absolutely. The size of the deficit, the remittance tax, these directly pressure allies, strain relationships. It shows how interconnected everything is. The bill tries to boost some domestic industries, but risks broader economic uncertainty and potentially lower social welfare.
Looking long-term, what's the potential trajectory? What are the uncertainties?
Big uncertainty around fiscal sustainability if that projected growth doesn't happen. Uncertainty about U.S.-allied relations if Economic unilateralism and things like the remittance tax become standard practice. Potential for widening domestic inequality.
And just the sheer uncertainty about the trade-offs.
Exactly. The balance between any growth benefits versus the costs of higher debt, trade friction, it's highly uncertain. Plus, using reconciliation for such massive policy shifts sets a potentially concerning precedent.
So what should different stakeholders be thinking about strategically?
Domestically, we need rigorous, independent monitoring of the outcomes. The debate over taxes, spending, and debt isn't going away. Allies probably need to diversify economically, strengthen regional ties, figure out calibrated responses to U.S. protectionism, and keep advocating for a stable, rules-based system.
And businesses
Need to navigate the uncertainty. Adapt to shifting incentives in clean energy versus fossil fuels, for example. Manage supply chain risks from trade tensions.
It feels like this bill, OBBBA, could really shift the conversation, redefine norms even.
It could. On acceptable deficit levels for partisan goals, the role of the social safety net domestically, internationally on how much economic pressure can be put on allies. Targeting remittances based on citizenship status is a big shift in how major powers interact with global finance and diaspora communities.
It could lead to a more fragmented global economy.
That's a risk. Domestically, big social program cuts, funding tax cuts, could set a new baseline for welfare debates. The long-term consequences are, well, far-reaching and very uncertain.
Absolutely. It definitely leaves you contemplating just how such a sweeping piece of legislation, with its many interconnected and often debated provisions, might ultimately alter the trajectory of American society and its place on the global stage. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look. See you next time.